Have you ever returned home anticipating tranquility, perhaps a sign of your absence like a dusty doormat after an extended journey, only to discover your entire existence being auctioned on your own property by an individual clad in excessive beige, sporting an expression of smug thievery? No, I hadn't either until it became my reality. I'm Sergeant Alex Mason, United States Army. And this is the plain, incredible account of how my homeowners association president, a woman whose aspirations greatly exceeded her good judgment or any apparent moral compass, attempted to sell off my residence, my furnishings, my vehicles, heck, quite possibly even my cherished deployment toothbrush. While I was supposedly many miles distant serving the nation in some remote, desolate location, she probably imagined she had struck a suburban gold mine. A swift sale, a gratification of her desire for control. Fair warning, what she truly encountered was a skillfully concealed, thoroughly angered explosive device. So, prepare yourselves because this narrative is more than just outrageous. It serves as a prime example of why one should avoid confronting an individual expertly conditioned to handle adverse situations. My overseas assignment had been unexpectedly shortened. Nothing overly dramatic, merely a training operation that concluded ahead of schedule owing to some logistical complications on the part of the host country coupled with a slight sprain to my knee during a final rappel. It wasn't severe enough to keep me deployed, but it was sufficiently bothersome for the medical staff to advise, "Return home, Sergeant. Allow it to heal before you cause more serious damage." Consequently, instead of coming back in another 3 months, I found myself stateside in a taxi, duffel bag at my feet, looking forward to the wonderful comfort of my personal sofa and a beer that didn't carry a taste of dissatisfaction. The taxi driver, a jovial man named S, was engaging in light conversation about the climate as we made our way onto my road, Maple Creek Lane, typically an image of peaceful suburban life. However, as we neared number 227, my residence, S's cheerful banter ceased abruptly. "Were you expecting company, Sarge?" he inquired, his brow furrowed in confusion. I was not. What I anticipated was stillness, possibly the aroma of unaired rooms, the quiet drone of the refrigerator. What greeted me was a spectacle of greed. My front yard, usually a well-kept stretch of green that I invested significantly to upkeep even during my absence, was teeming with individuals. Deal seekers, opportunists, describe them as you wish. My couch, a plush leather piece I had diligently saved for, was positioned near the roadside bearing a vivid yellow Lot 37 tag. My dining table, at which I had eaten precisely one meal prior to my deployment, was similarly marked. And there, akin to a monarch overseeing her illicitly gained riches, was Karen. Karen. Her complete name was Karen Pendleton. But in the history of Maple Creek HOA, she was, and will always remain, simply Karen. She was a woman who brandished her self-assumed power like an improperly sized counterfeit designer item, showy, brash, and ultimately without real substance. On this day, she was in her prime, attired in a beige pantsuit that struggled valiantly against her substantial figure, a pair of large sunglasses set on her nose despite the cloudy sky, and a clipboard held firmly to her chest as if it held state secrets. An auctioneer, a dapper-looking man with a microphone, was just getting started, his voice creating a slight echo. And coming up next, folks, a lovely cherrywood coffee table, almost new. Am I bid $50? I experienced a chilling rage, the type that takes root deep within you, frosty and piercing. This was not merely a trespass. It was a violation. My taxi fare was instantly out of mind. I exited the vehicle before S could even shift it into park, my duffel bag landing on the ground with a solid thump. I advanced towards Karen, my limp momentarily unheeded, the crowd parting slightly as they perceived the expression on my face. It must have presented quite a scene, me still in my dusty combat footwear and somewhat creased travel clothes. My face stern as stone, marching towards the self-proclaimed ruler of the cul-de-sac. "Karen," I stated, my voice low and perilously composed. She pivoted, a brief hint of astonishment in her eyes swiftly supplanted by that customary, disdainful smirk. Well, see what appeared. "Sergeant Mason, correct? You're somewhat off your timeline and, I should mention, intruding on private HOA matters. Private HOA matters on my property with my belongings. What in the blazes?" I started, maintaining an even tone despite the surge of fury. "Do you think you're doing?" She actually clucked her tongue. "Mind your language, Sergeant. This estate." She gestured dismissively towards my house. "My home is under an HOA lien and slated for auction due to considerable delinquency and, quite frankly, desertion. It's all entirely lawful. All perfectly transparent." Her smile was pure, unadulterated smugness. She genuinely felt she was in complete control. Delinquency. My HOA fees were set to autopay from an account specifically allocated for all my household expenses while I was deployed. Abandonment. The HOA board, herself included, had been sent a letter from my CO's office verifying my deployment status and its anticipated length, along with contact details for my rear detachment. I inhaled slowly, my training taking over. Observe, evaluate, avoid uncontrolled escalation. Acquire information. My gaze swept across the area. My treasured vintage Ducati Monster, which I kept under a cover in the garage, was now on the driveway, a sold sign already affixed to its windshield. My slightly less cherished but equally vital Ford pickup? The same situation. The sheer nerve was astonishing. This was not merely an overenthusiastic HOA president on a power kick. This felt targeted, predatory. I remarked, my voice lowering another degree, "You have committed a colossal error." Her smirk wavered almost imperceptibly. "The sole error here, Sergeant, was your assumption that you could disregard your community responsibilities. The HOA possesses regulations. Regulations I plan to uphold." She puffed her chest. I retrieved my phone. "That's intriguing, Karen, because I am fairly sure there are also regulations against grand larceny, unlawful eviction, and fraud. Let's ascertain what the local authorities think about your understanding of community responsibilities." Her face, already somewhat flushed beneath the beige, began to model. "You wouldn't attempt it. This is an official HOA procedure." I was already keying in the numbers. 911, what is your emergency?" a calm voice inquired. "Yes," I responded, my gaze fixed on Karen's rapidly paling countenance. "My name is Sergeant Alex Mason. I am an active duty soldier, and I have just come back to my residence at 227 Maple Creek Lane to discover the HOA president, a Ms. Karen Pendleton, attempting to unlawfully auction my house, my vehicles, and all my personal effects. I suspect several felonies are currently underway." The dispatcher, to her credit, responded without hesitation. "Sir, are you in a secure place? Are they armed?" "Armed with a clipboard and a frightening degree of self-importance, perhaps. I am positioned on my front lawn, which is presently an unauthorized auction location," I answered. "The main person responsible is unarmed but dangerously mistaken." Karen started to splutter. "How dare you?" "Officer, this individual is trespassing. He deserted this property. He is clearly not stable." The auctioneer had gone quiet, his microphone producing a soft hissing sound. The crowd was murmuring, sensing the unfolding events were about to escalate significantly. The first siren sounded in the distance, a wonderful, wonderful noise. Karen appeared as if she had ingested a hornet. This was merely the initial confrontation, and I sensed the battle for Maple Creek Lane was destined to be memorable. The appearance of the first patrol vehicle, its lights gently flashing in the dim afternoon, caused a temporary cessation of Karen's outraged protests. Two officers stepped out, an experienced-looking senior policeman, Officer Miller, and his younger, more visibly perplexed associate, Officer Davies. Miller possessed that seen-it-all fatigue, yet his gaze was keen. Karen, regaining her composure with surprising swiftness, began her well-practiced victim story. "Officers, thank goodness you have arrived. This man," she indicated with a dramatically quivering finger towards me, "is Sergeant Mason, a previous occupant who deserted his residence months ago. He is overdue on more than a year's worth of HOA dues, and the residence was legally foreclosed upon by the Homeowners Association as per our regulations. We are merely conducting a legitimate asset disposal to recover the outstanding amounts. He is trespassing and creating a commotion." She even contrived to produce what seemed very much like a false tear. It was a display fit for a daytime drama, though one with a severely restricted budget for wardrobe. Officer Miller faced me, his look unreadable. "Sir, your account of this." I showed my military identification, my driver's permit with the 227 Maple Creek Lane address, and then the critical evidence, my official deployment documentation, and the communication from my unit verifying my active duty status and projected return schedule, which was still meant to be several months later. "Officer," I stated composedly, "as you can observe, I am Sergeant Alex Mason, the rightful owner of this residence. I am on active military service and only arrived back in the country today because of a minor injury. My HOA dues are, and consistently have been, on automatic withdrawal. I had my banking application open on my phone, prepared to display the payment records. Ms. Pendleton here was formally informed of my deployment. There has been no desertion, and any purported delinquency is a fabrication. She is attempting to unlawfully take my home and belongings." Officer Davies appeared increasingly uneasy, looking back and forth between Karen's now furious expression and my composed delivery of the facts. Officer Miller accepted the papers, looked them over, then turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, these papers appear to support Sergeant Mason's account. Do you possess copies of the foreclosure notifications, evidence of their delivery, and documentation of the supposed delinquencies that you can present to us immediately?" Karen's complexion underwent a captivating series of changes from beige to puce, then to a startling shade of purple. "Well, naturally, they're at the HOA office. This is extremely out of the ordinary. He's clearly attempting to pressure us." "We adhered to the correct procedure," she asserted, grasping her clipboard more firmly as if it were a defense against approaching justice. "The procedure for foreclosing on the residence of an active duty service member without appropriate court orders and SCRE waivers is, in fact, highly unlawful, ma'am," I interjected softly, yet loud enough for the officers and the now very focused crowd to hear. The Service Members Civil Relief Act was not merely some indefinite instruction, it possessed real power, and Karen seemed to be just comprehending she might get caught by it. Officer Miller gave a slow nod. "Sergeant Mason is accurate, Ms. Pendleton. This auction must stop at once. All items are to be brought back onto the property. We will need to inspect those documents you referred to, and frankly, you may wish to seek legal counsel." The auctioneer, appearing as though he'd rather be anywhere else on the planet, swiftly began signaling to his team to dismantle. The bargain seekers started to drift away, some complaining, others observing Karen with unconcealed interest and a growing sense of doubt. Karen, however, was not inclined to withdraw with dignity. "This is a disgrace, an insult to the neighborhood. You have not heard the end of this, Sergeant Mason," she hissed, her tone filled with malice. "The HOA board will take this matter as far as the law allows. You will be contacted by our attorneys." With a final glare potent enough to sour milk, she turned sharply and marched away, her beige pantsuit almost quivering with restrained anger. The officers remained until the auction team had grudgingly repositioned my sofa onto the porch and my coffee table into the living room, albeit not without a few fresh scratches. My Ducati and truck were, thankfully, still in my possession. Once the area was comparatively clear, Officer Miller gave me a card. "Sergeant, if she causes you any further issues or if you find out anything else, contact me directly. And I recommend you replace your locks straight away." Sensible guidance. As the police car departed, a few individuals tentatively came out from adjacent houses. One was Mrs. Henderson, a delightful elderly lady from the opposite side of the street, known for her splendid rose garden and an equally notable dislike for Karen Pendleton. "Alex, my dear, thank goodness you have returned," she declared, hurrying over with a plate of cookies that appeared as if by enchantment. "That woman is a dreadful person. She has been observing your residence for months since you departed. She continued to mumble about an unoccupied property being an eyesore and a safety concern even though your lawn care was faultless, and I informed her you were serving our nation. Another neighbor, a reserved man named David, proposed to assist me in properly moving my furniture back indoors. He also shared that he had noticed unfamiliar vans near my house a few days earlier and had found it peculiar. He had even captured a few images on his phone because Karen appeared to be overseeing some kind of illicit operation. Small gestures of goodwill, but they were like a soothing balm to my agitated state. Once I was inside, the disarray was less apparent but more unsettling. Drawers had been rummaged through, closets left open. Some smaller, valuable possessions were clearly gone. A set of old maps, my grandfather's military decorations. The feeling of being violated was intense. This was not merely about possessions, it was about my existence, my personal history being interfered with and stolen. That evening, after replacing the locks and thankfully receiving Mrs. Henderson's cookies and David's assistance, I did not find sleep. I sat at my retrieved dining table, a borrowed laptop whirring, and commenced my counterattack. My military background, especially the parts concerning intelligence collection, thorough documentation, and comprehension of command structures and operational guidelines, shifted into full swing. This was no longer just a personal insult. It was Operation HOA Takedown. I accessed my stored digital version of the Maple Creek HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, a document so thick and soporific it could be used as a sleep-inducing tool. I compelled myself to examine every obscure provision, every subarticle outlining processes for dues, liens, special charges, and, most importantly, disciplinary measures and property confiscations. I checked these against my bank records, every single HOA payment made punctually verified. I scanned my emails, my physical mail that Mrs. Henderson had graciously gathered. Not one formal notification of delinquency, no certified letters, no alerts of approaching disaster, only the standard newsletters regarding approved exterior paint shades and reminders for recycling collection. Then I recalled the HOA's awkward online portal, which I seldom accessed. Perhaps Karen, in her boundless shrewdness, had posted notifications there, aware that deployed personnel rarely possess dependable, uninterrupted internet service for such minor matters. Gaining entry was difficult, my password long since forgotten. But following a vexing reset procedure, I was in. I went to the member documents area, and there it was, a folder named Mason 227, delinquency/foreclosure. My blood turned cold, then hot. Within were scanned PDFs, supposed notices of overdue payments escalating to a final warning of intent to lien, and subsequently a notice of HOA foreclosure auction. The dates all fell within the preceding 3 months. Conveniently, these notices were allegedly dispatched via certified mail. But to which address? Not my APO box. Not my parents' address, which I had provided as an emergency contact. No, they were sent to my residence, 227 Maple Creek Lane, with a hastily written annotation, "Return to sender. Addressee deployed." And then the clincher. A purported waiver of service document supposedly endorsed by me consenting to the foreclosure. The signature was a clumsy, absurd imitation. It appeared as if a youngster had attempted to copy my name while on a unicycle. This was not merely ineptitude or excessive zeal. This was unmistakable, premeditated fraud. Karen hadn't just disregarded the regulations, she had broken them entirely and tried to use the fragments against me. And that was her second colossal error. She believed I was merely a soldier. She overlooked that soldiers are also trained to engage in conflict. The revelation of that counterfeit signature acted like a jolt of stimulant. This was no longer solely about reclaiming my possessions or halting Karen's minor despotism. This was about taking apart a deceitful scheme. The following morning, I was on the telephone seeking lawyers who specialized in HOA disagreements and property fraud. I required someone astute, someone who would not be cowed by HOA bluster, and someone who grasped the seriousness of SCRA infringements. I located him, Mr. Blank's 43 HOA bluster, Civi HOA bluster, and FSTR. Arthur Davenport, a semi-retired, tenacious lawyer renowned for methodically deconstructing corrupt HOAs. His preliminary consultation was complimentary, but his expertise, I discerned, was invaluable. When I presented my account, supported by my initial compilation of proof, military directives, bank records, the deployment alert letter to the HOA, photographs of the attempted auction, and the crucial piece, the printout of the falsified waiver from the HOA portal, Davenport's dense eyebrows, which had at first been arched in polite doubt, gradually lowered into a predatory V-shape. "Sergeant Mason," he remarked, his voice a deep growl, "most individuals arrive here filled with justifiable rage but very little documentation. You have arrived with a complete file. This Karen Pendleton, she isn't merely overambitious, is she? She's engaging in a highly perilous activity, particularly with a service member." He consented to handle the case, a spark in his eye indicating he anticipated the forthcoming struggle. Our immediate task was to dispatch a cease and desist letter so forceful it likely singed Karen's eyebrows upon reading. It called for the prompt return of any of my belongings still unaccounted for, unrestricted access to all HOA documents related to my account and the foreclosure actions, and a total cessation of any further measures against me. We also formally warned them about the SCRA violations and the undisguised forgery. Davenport suspected Karen had not acted in isolation. An endeavor like this, attempting to confiscate and auction a residence, she would require board consent or, at minimum, the cooperation of the treasurer and secretary for the documentation, he considered. Let's identify her accomplices. Mrs. Henderson, my source of neighborhood intelligence, readily provided the names: Bartholomew Barty Higgins, the treasurer, a timid, subservient individual who perpetually seemed on the verge of apologizing for his own being, and a retiring secretary named Agnes Periwinkle, who was utterly intimidated by Karen. According to Mrs. H., Barty would comply with any of Karen's directives, and Agnes simply endorsed whatever was presented to her to evade disagreement. Ideal collaborators. Davenport then instructed me on a more official evidence collection endeavor. We issued subpoenas, or rather, dispatched a very firmly phrased legal request initially for all HOA meeting records from the past year, financial reports, and all communications concerning my property. The first reply from the HOA's newly engaged and probably highly agitated lawyer was, as expected, uncooperative, filled with technical terms and postponements. but Davenport was skilled at navigating through bureaucratic obstruction. While the legal proceedings advanced slowly, I conducted my own investigation. I conversed with more neighbors. Some remained reluctant, visibly cowed by Karen's dominance. Yet a few, encouraged by my conspicuous resistance and the sight of Officer Miller's card on my refrigerator, started to share their experiences. One described how Karen had compelled them to repaint their front door on 3 occasions because the shade of blue was not adequately historic, even though the color was part of the pre-approved HOA selection. Another recounted receiving excessive fines for leaving a child's bicycle on their own patio overnight. A consistent behavior of random, spiteful enforcement became apparent. Karen, in the meantime, was not passively accepting this. Perhaps she believed boldness was her strongest defense. I began to get a barrage of new infraction notices from the HOA, delivered by a hesitant-looking youth, clearly compensated meagerly to act as Karen's messenger. Improperly parked vehicle in driveway, for my own truck, parked on my own driveway. Unapproved landscaping alterations, for the indentations the auction company's equipment had made on my lawn. My personal favorite was failure to obtain prior written approval for unscheduled return from active military deployment, which was so preposterously despotic, it was almost humorous. I meticulously recorded each one, appending it to the expanding file for Mr. Davenport. Each notice served as another piece of evidence against Karen. She was, in her conceit, furnishing us with even more proof of her personal vendetta and illogical conduct. The significant advancement, however, originated from an unforeseen quarter. I had set up a couple of inconspicuous, cloud-linked security cameras prior to my deployment. One monitored my front porch and driveway, another the side entry to my garage. I had almost overlooked them in the initial commotion. One evening, sustained by tepid coffee and justifiable anger, I accessed the cloud storage. I began to review the recordings from the days preceding the auction. And there it was, perfectly clear, time-stamped 3 days before my arrival. The footage depicted Karen Pendleton herself, along with the constantly worried Bartholomew Higgins, on my front porch. Barty was nervously clutching a stack of documents, presumably the notices, while Karen gestured emphatically towards my mailbox. She then took the documents from Barty, made a display of attempting to force them into the already crammed mailbox, full of mail Mrs. Henderson had not yet retrieved for me, then withdrew them with a dramatic exhalation. She glanced around surreptitiously, then unmistakably mouthed to Barty, "See, undeliverable. He's abandoned it." Then came the truly incriminating segment. She turned slightly, her profile captured perfectly, and spoke to Barty. Her voice, regrettably, was not recorded by the camera's microphone, but her lips were easily decipherable with some freeze framing and magnification. Something to the effect of, "This will proceed so effortlessly. Sergeant Mason will be completely blindsided until it's over. And the money from this deserted property will at last finance my special community enhancement initiative." Bartholomew wrung his hands but acquiesced with a nod. I replayed it, then watched it once more. Special Community Enhancement Initiative. I later learned from a now considerably more cooperative Agnes Periwinkle, after Davenport dispatched a very courteous but resolute letter detailing her potential liabilities as a board officer, that Karen's special project was a new imported Italian marble birdbath and an assortment of prize-winning exotic petunias for her own immaculately kept backyard, which she had been lamenting the HOA General Fund could not possibly afford. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it. This wasn't merely about dominance. It was about enriching herself, quite literally, with my possessions. I preserved the footage, created several backups, and sent a copy via email to Davenport with the subject, "Christmas arrived early." He contacted me within 10 minutes, his voice vibrant with what I can only term as joyful, lawyerly anticipation. "Sergeant," he chortled, "I believe we have just located our conclusive proof, or in this instance, our incriminating birdbath." With the security camera evidence showing Karen and Bartholomew essentially admitting their plan and faking the undeliverable notice scenario, Mr. Davenport announced it was time to shift from a defensive to an offensive strategy. "She believes she's invulnerable in her petty domain," he remarked, tapping a pen on the printouts of the incriminating images. "We must confront her on her own ground, before the other homeowners." The subsequent HOA general meeting was scheduled in 2 weeks. We will ask to be included on the agenda. He composed a formal communication to the HOA board via their bewildered legal counsel, asking for an opportunity to address urgent issues of HOA administration, financial discrepancies, and potential wrongdoing by board officials. The wording was civil but carried significant weight. Karen, as anticipated, attempted to refuse the request, asserting the agenda was already packed and our allegations were baseless and disruptive. Davenport, however, had foreseen this. He cited the HOA's own regulations back at them, a particular provision permitting any homeowner in good standing, which I now demonstrably was, despite Karen's attempts, to add items to the agenda with adequate prior notification. A decisive move. He also, very subtly, had a private conversation with Agnes Periwinkle, the retiring secretary. He did not issue threats. He merely explained the potential legal consequences for board members who knowingly approved or disregarded fraudulent conduct, especially something as grave as violating the SCRA. Agnes, he informed me, became a shade whiter than her customary beige office attire and vowed to make sure the issue was correctly placed on the agenda. In the period leading up to the meeting, we prepared with great care. We put together a presentation, a straightforward chronological account of events, backed by duplicates of my deployment directives, bank records confirming dues were paid, the HOA's own failure to communicate the counterfeit waiver, and still images from the security footage. The conclusive evidence would be the video segment itself. We also formulated a roster of official demands. Meanwhile, information about the approaching confrontation was circulating through Maple Creek rapidly, largely due to Mrs. Henderson's highly efficient neighborhood communication network. The sentiment within the community transformed from hushed unease to eager anticipation. It appeared many inhabitants had their own accounts of Karen's minor acts of tyranny and were keen to witness her finally being held accountable. Karen, for her part, endeavored to maintain an appearance of untroubled command, distributing a particularly sharp HOA newsletter concerning the significance of upholding aesthetic order by ensuring all waste containers were kept hidden from view, even on days without collection. It was a pitiful bid to re-establish control, and everyone recognized it for what it was. The evening of the HOA meeting came. The community clubhouse, typically the venue for uninspired potluck dinners and poorly attended committee meetings, was filled to capacity. Additional seating had been arranged, and individuals were standing along the perimeter. The atmosphere was charged with expectancy. Karen presided at the main table, accompanied by Bartholomew Higgins, who seemed not to have rested for a week and continuously wiped his upper lip with a handkerchief, and Agnes Periwinkle, who appeared to be attempting to become unnoticeable by slumping further into her seat. Karen tried to commence the meeting with her standard, uninspired declarations about forthcoming gutter maintenance schedules, but the palpable strain in the room was undeniable. When she at last, reluctantly, declared our agenda item, a profound silence descended upon the assembly. Mr. Davenport and I assumed our positions at a modest table facing the board. I started, my voice unwavering and deliberate. I presented the circumstances, my military service, my deployment, the automatic payments, the complete absence of legitimate correspondence from the HOA regarding any purported problems. I displayed copies of my bank statements and military orders, projecting them onto a screen we had brought. Murmurs spread through the attendees. Then Mr. Davenport rose. His bearing was composed, almost scholarly, but his statements were like precisely aimed projectiles. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association," he commenced, "what Sergeant Mason has just outlined is profoundly disturbing, but it is, regrettably, merely the start of the account." He then methodically refuted Karen's entire version of events, detailing the explicit infractions of Virginia state law concerning HOA foreclosures, the distinct and grave violations of the Federal Servicemembers Civil Relief Act, and the prima facie proof of falsification on the alleged waiver document. He elucidated in straightforward language the potential civil and even criminal responsibilities entailed. One could observe the color receding from Bartholomew's face. Agnes was now openly quivering. Karen, nonetheless, preserved an appearance of offended innocence, her arms crossed firmly, a contemptuous smile fixed on her lips. "This is absurd, defamatory. We adhered to all HOA procedures," she proclaimed, her voice somewhat too loud, somewhat too piercing. Procedures, Ms. Pendleton, Davenport stated, his voice becoming smooth. Let us discuss procedures. He gestured to me. This was my signal. I pressed the remote, and the security camera recording started to play on the screen. The clubhouse was entirely still, save for the soft whir of the projector. There was Karen on my porch with Bartholomew. Her dramatic gesticulations, her secretive glances. Then the close-up as she formed the words, Sergeant Mason will never know what hit him. Proceeds. Special Community Beautification Project. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Karen's jaw literally fell. Her complexion changed from puce to a dreadful, mottled white. Bartholomew seemed to be actively seeking an escape route. The other, less significant board members, who had perhaps been merely careless or intentionally unobservant, now appeared aghast. They were witnessing, in undeniable visual clarity, the architect of their possible ruin. Karen attempted to rally. That recording is manipulated. It's counterfeit. He's attempting to incriminate me, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. But her disavowal was unpersuasive, frantic. The visual proof was too conclusive. The meticulously crafted image of Karen Pendleton, a respected figure in the community, was disintegrating before everyone's gaze. The quiet in that room was so intense it could be sliced with a combat knife. Karen's impeccably styled hair appeared to shake with outrage. Her beige bastion of conceit was at last, definitively shattered. The momentum hadn't merely shifted. It was a deluge, and she was directly in its course. The video concluded. For a brief period, the sole sound in the clubhouse was Karen Pendleton's uneven respiration. Then, Mr. Davenport, in a tone that was subdued but bore the gravity of approaching legal disaster, spoke to the assembly, and particularly to Karen. Ms. Pendleton, alleging doctored footage is a grave charge. We, naturally, possess the original, unaltered cloud recording, complete with metadata, which I am confident the authorities will find exceedingly persuasive should this proceed to a criminal inquiry for fraud, conspiracy, and infractions of federal law. He paused, allowing his words to register. Bartholomew Higgins emitted a faint, strangled noise, like a drowning rodent. Agnes Periwinkle appeared on the verge of collapsing. Even the other, more minor board members, a pair of retirees who typically just went along with things, were now gazing at Karen with unconcealed dismay. Their silent acquiescence was about to have very visible repercussions. Then, the floodgate of resident exasperation burst. It wasn't a yell, but an increasing hum that evolved into clear voices. Old Mr. Abernathy, who seldom spoke, rose, his voice shaky with age but resolute with belief. That woman, Karen. She penalized me $500 because my grandson's tricycle was visible from the road for 2 hours. 2 hours. Mrs. Sprowickle, Rodriguez added. And she attempted to compel us to remove our children's treehouse, claiming it infringed upon airspace regulations, whatever that signifies. It's been standing for 10 years. One by one, homeowners stood, encouraged by the public revelation of Karen's misdeeds, sharing their own encounters with her minor acts of oppression, excessive fines for minor violations, and her generally dictatorial governance. It was like a dam breaking, years of suppressed anger flowing out. Karen attempted to silence them. Order! Order! This is not an occasion for airing complaints. But her dominance had vanished. She was no longer the respected leader of Maple Creek. She was merely a woman in an overly tight beige pantsuit, revealed and trapped. Mr. Davenport waited for a brief quiet moment, then advanced once more. Considering the evidence presented and the unmistakable feeling of this community, he declared, his voice cutting through the diminishing anger, we have several official requests. He held up a paper. 1. The immediate departure of Ms. Karen Pendleton as HOA president and from the board of directors. 2. The immediate departure of Mr. Place. Bartholomew Higgins as HOA treasurer and from the board, given his evident involvement. Bartholomew actually let out a whimper and slumped further in his seat, hiding his face in his hands. 3. The HOA will arrange for a complete, independent forensic examination of all HOA financial records for the entire duration of Ms. Pendleton's presidency. 4. The HOA will release a formal public apology to Sergeant Mason for the unlawful measures taken against him, the suffering inflicted, and the harm to his good name and property. 5. Complete compensation will be provided to Sergeant Mason for all legal expenses incurred, the cost to replace any lost or harmed property, and suitable damages for the severe infringement of his rights under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. He then continued, looking straight at the remaining board members. And we strongly urge the board to examine and overturn any and all disciplinary measures, penalties, or liens imposed under Ms. Prius Pendleton's direction that cannot be clearly and definitively supported by a just and sensible understanding of the CC and RS. The remaining board members exchanged glances, then looked at Karen, then back at Davenport. The apprehension in their eyes was obvious. One of them, a gentleman named Henderson, no connection to my kind neighbor, unfortunately for Karen, who typically just read the meeting records, cleared his throat with unease. Ms. Brussum, BuzzyGGRAN.com. Pendleton. Karen, I believe, considering what we have observed, perhaps it would be advisable if you thought about resigning. His voice was barely audible, but in the tense quiet, it resonated like a cannon blast. Karen looked at him, then at me, her expression a combination of rage and disbelief. For an instant, I anticipated she might erupt or perhaps attempt to physically assault someone with her clipboard. Instead, she grabbed her handbag, let out a single, choked cry that was more beastly than human, and rushed out of the clubhouse, almost knocking over Mrs. Henderson, who was positioned near the exit with a small, pleased smile. Bartholomew, without speaking, wrote something on a piece of paper, likely his resignation, and hurried out after her, appearing like a humbled creature. Agnes Periwinkle, with tears flowing down her cheeks, merely nodded silently when questioned if she would guarantee the requests were officially documented. The dominion of Karen was definitively finished. The clubhouse erupted, not with shouts of joy, but with a collective sigh of relief, followed by an animated, liberated hum of discussion. Justice, as it happened, did not invariably appear in uniform. Occasionally, it was attired in a smart suit and carried a thoroughly prepared file of evidence. The consequences of Karen's dramatic public downfall were immediate and, for her, severe. The remaining board members, anxious about being implicated with her, almost stumbled over each other to meet Mr. Davenport's stipulations. An interim board was quickly established, comprised of some of the more sensible homeowners who had previously been too cowed to participate, including, to my astonishment and quiet satisfaction, Mrs. Henderson, who took her nomination with a cheerful glint in her eye, assuring practical gardening projects and a complete absence of beige. The forensic examination was set in motion at once, and its initial findings were even more dire than we had first imagined. Karen and Bartholomew hadn't merely intended to use my auction funds for her birdbath, they had been methodically embezzling from HOA finances for an extended period, inflated landscaping costs that benefited Karen, payments for consultancy to a fictitious company Bartholomew had created, emergency repairs that were never carried out. The special community beautification project was merely the visible part of a larger issue. It emerged that my brush with disaster was the event that uncovered a long-standing fraudulent operation. Legally, Karen Pendleton and Bartholomew Higgins found themselves in dire straits. The HOA, under its new leadership and with Mr. Davenport's counsel, filed a civil lawsuit against them to reclaim the misappropriated funds, which the audit approximated to be in the tens of thousands. My personal compensation was considerable, Davenport ensured it. The SCRA violations alone brought substantial fines, and that was prior to considering the emotional suffering, the expense of substituting my stolen antique maps and grandfather's medals, some of which, regrettably, were irreplaceable family treasures whose absence pained me more than any monetary loss, and my legal costs. Karen was compelled to sell her own large house, the one with the soon-to-be-renowned Petunia Garden, to meet her legal obligations and the first restitution installments. The last I was aware, she resided in a small apartment across town, her aspirations of Italian marble birdbaths now unrealized. Bartholomew, characteristically, cooperated entirely with the authorities in return for a somewhat less devastating penalty, though his standing was permanently damaged. There was even discussion of criminal proceedings for fraud and embezzlement by the county prosecutor, prompted by the sheer audacity of their actions and the SCRA infractions involving an active duty soldier. For myself, existence gradually reverted to a semblance of normalcy, albeit a transformed one. The neighborhood organized a proper welcome home, Sergeant Mason cookout, where Mrs. Henderson gifted me an absolutely splendid apple pie. The new HOA board, with remarkable effectiveness, revised the outdated, harsh regulations, prioritizing openness and practical sense. Unjust penalties were annulled. The ambience in Maple Creek changed from one of quiet discontent to authentic neighborly feeling. It appeared most individuals simply desired to reside calmly without being overly controlled by a petty despot. I even became involved in a very informal capacity, assisting them in establishing more dependable and transparent digital documentation methods. A small contribution to prevent a Karen-like individual from easily distorting matters in the future. Contemplating the entire bizarre series of events, it remains difficult to grasp the sheer impudence of it all. Karen's inflated self-importance and her grave misjudgment of the person she was confronting led to her downfall. She perceived a soldier, mistook an absence for an opening, and believed her weak authority was unquestionable. She overlooked that soldiers are conditioned to assess dangers, collect information, and carry out strategies with exactitude, abilities surprisingly applicable to suburban conflicts. There was a somber irony in how her efforts to exploit and misuse regulations ultimately resulted in her being overwhelmed by the rightful force of the law. It served as a clear illustration that unconstrained power, even on the limited stage of an HOA, can lead to absolute corruption, and that resisting oppressors, regardless of how established they appear, is not merely a prerogative but a duty. My grandfather's medals were never found, and that is a sorrow I will always carry. But the tranquility and justice that were restored to Maple Creek, that was a triumph in itself. So, what is the lesson from this suburban tale? Well, consistently maintain thorough records. Be aware of your rights and your HOA regulations, however monotonous they may be. And never, ever presume the unassuming individual in combat footwear is an easy target. At times, the most significant confrontations occur not on faraway lands, but directly in your own front yard against an adversary equipped with a clipboard and an excessive amount of beige. You never know what unpredictable events life or your local HOA might present.